The adenoviruses are so named because they were isolated from adenoid cell culture. There are 100 serotypes that we know of. About 52 of them are known to infect humans, and there are 7 subgroups that are labeled A through G. Of the types that infect humans, types 1 through 7 are most common. And the types of infections you're going to see will range from respiratory infection to pink eye, GI infections, a pretty broad tissue tropism. These viruses are known to be oncogenic in other species. However, to this point, we have not yet identified a cancer caused by adenoviruses in people. These are also double-stranded, naked DNA viruses, like our papillomaviruses. However, the genome here is much larger. These have a genome of approximately 36,000 base pairs, so more than 4 times the length with the genome. One of the unique things that you can see in this electron micrograph, but you can see it more clearly in this drawing, are these kind of cool little spiky proteins that come off the capsid. And these fibers actually help mediate attachment to the host cell and also can have some toxicity and cause host cell complications. So these are naked viruses that have fibers that are helpful for attachment at the ends. The double-stranded genome is linear and it has proteins on the 5' terminal end. The virus can encode its own DNA polymerase, and it has other proteins to help facilitate growth and escape from the immune system. The adenoviruses that infect humans are grouped A through G by DNA homology and by serotype. So this data says more than 55 human types. So we're looking 50 to 60 or so that we know of. Serotype is mainly as a result of differences in the base and the fiber protein, which determine the nature of the tissue tropism and the disease. In humans, we tend to see lytic, persistent, or latent infections. In animal cells, we can see cancer. That's what we mean by immortalized. The replication cycle is approximately 36 hours, and every cell that's infected will release about 10,000 virions. Those virions will then attach to glycoproteins on the cell surface. The virus will then be internalized and transported to the nucleus because that's where DNA replication and transcription occur. They do encode their own DNA polymerase, and they have other proteins which can lead to inhibition of the immune response and promotion of cell growth. Remember, like I mentioned with the papillomaviruses, viruses need to be in an actively dividing cell. So if they happen to infect a cell that is not currently dividing, they need to be able to promote that cell growth. The virus can be spread through a number of different mechanisms: aerosols, fecal matter, close contact. We tend to see the virus infect mucoepithelial cells, GI, respiratory, conjunctiva, and they can cause direct cell damage. The disease itself is determined by the tissue tropism of that specific group. In certain lymphoid tissues like the tonsils, adenoids, and Peyer's patches, you can see persistence of the virus. Antibody is important because antibody can help neutralize the virus as it's trying to spread from cell to cell. But cell-mediated immunity is also really important. If every infected cell is going to release 10,000 viral particles in the next 36 hours, we need our cell-mediated immunity to come in and kill those infected cells, because that is a huge risk of spread of the infection. Histology will show dense nuclei, so you're going to see really dark nuclei. And that's because it's because the nucleus is full of viral DNA and viral proteins. With adenoviruses, you can have viremia, where the virus enters the bloodstream as it leaves the first tissue. And as I mentioned, antibody is protective because antibodies will bind to the virus itself, preventing them from getting into the host cell. But cell-mediated immunity is important. We can follow the tract, the trace of the virus through the body. Often you'll have inoculation, most commonly in the eye or upper respiratory tract, or even the GI tract. But again, most commonly we think of adenoviruses as causing a cold-like symptoms. From the eye, they can move to the upper respiratory tract. From the upper respiratory tract, they could eventually migrate to the GI tract or lower respiratory tract. And you'll notice, I hope you notice, that when we're going from the upper respiratory tract to the GI, I don't say anything about viremia, nothing about the bloodstream. Remember, one of our mechanisms for defending our upper respiratory tract is our mucociliary escalator. We constantly have cilia that line the respiratory tract that bring viral particles up and dump, viral particles, dust, bacteria, mucus, bring it up our respiratory tract and dump it down our esophagus. So in that way, we could theoretically dump virus from our respiratory tract into our GI tract. And because these are naked viruses, they are acid tolerant. So they will tolerate the stomach acid and they can cause GI upset. So that's how they can go directly from your respiratory tract to the GI tract without going into the bloodstream. From there, they can enter the lymph nodes. After the lymph nodes, that's where you get them into the bloodstream, and then they can go to the skin, other organs. You can have resolution, or you can have a latent infection. I mentioned that adenoviruses are resistant to many environmental factors. That's because they're naked. They are spread by aerosols, through the fecal-oral route, fomites, and also ponds or poorly chlorinated pools. Okay, so if somebody has a GI adenovirus, gets into a poorly chlorinated pool, and then you get into that poorly chlorinated pool, it's not pretty. You swallow the water, it gets in your eyes, you're out of luck. Many infections can be asymptomatic and shed for a very long time. Serotypes 1 and 7 are the most common. However, 4 and 7 are really common in the military, the close quarters. And so because they are common in the military, there are vaccines available for them. So here's a case study. The CDC reports an analysis of isolates from trainees during an outbreak of febrile respiratory infection at Lackland Air Force Base. This is in San Antonio. Showed 63% resulting from adenovirus, and 90% of those were adenovirus 14. Of the 423 cases, 27 were hospitalized with pneumonia, 5 required admission to the intensive care unit, and 1 patient died. So they all got adenoviruses from close quarters in the military. And oftentimes we think of soldiers as being, really physically fit. Lackland is one of the training bases. So you've got a lot of new airmen who have recently joined the military. I've never been in the military. My brother was, and I've worked with a lot of soldiers and airmen and everything. Basic training is hard on the body, and it can make them more susceptible to infection, even though typically they're very strong and healthy. So that's why they're more prone to getting more severe disease. And because they're living in close quarters, like barracks, things are going to spread. In an analogous case reported by CNN, An 18-year-old high school athlete complained of flu-like symptoms with vomiting, chills, a fever of 104 that progressed to life-threatening pneumonia within days. The adenovirus causing these infections is a mutant of adenovirus 14, which was first identified in 1955. The adenovirus 14 mutant has spread around the US, putting adults at risk for severe disease. It generally causes a benign respiratory infection in adults, with newborns and the elderly at higher risk for severe outcomes. Although most virus mutations produce a weaker virus, occasionally a more virulent antibody escape or antiviral drug-resistant virus may occur. So, viral mutations can be really dangerous. And when you have a case of patients who hold a virus for a long time that have latent infections, it's more likely that the virus has a chance to mutate. Adenoviruses are most common in children, pharyngitis and conjunctivitis, so sore throats and pink eye. Usually we see an acute respiratory disease with fever, runny nose, cough, and sore throat. They have a cold. That's pretty much what we're talking about. There is a high incidence in the military. Again, the temporary immune suppression of the stressful conditions of military training and also living in barracks. We do see adenovirus causing GI infections in infants most commonly, diarrhea. Immune compromised individuals are at high risk for serious systemic disease. For the most part, people do not get diagnosed with an adenovirus. If you have a cold, you most likely stay home. You don't go to work. Hopefully you don't come to class because nobody else wants your cold. And you recover for a couple of days. However, if your virus is a little bit more severe or there's a big outbreak, you may be diagnosed, and typically that will be through immunoassays or genome assays. It will grow pretty readily in cell culture derived from mucoepithelial cells, and it's relatively easy to prevent with hand washing or pool chlorination. And if you've got a cold, please stop going out in public or wear your mask. Everybody knows about masks now. Please wear them. There are no approved treatments. If you take a child, if you take yourself, if you take a family member to the doctor with a viral infection and they prescribe you antibiotics, please find a new doctor. Okay, unless you are at significant risk for a secondary bacterial infection. If you have a cold and the doctor gives you antibiotics, get a new doctor. One of the other interesting aspects of adenoviruses is that because they are so prevalent and because they will infect so many different cell types, scientists have been using adenoviruses as gene therapy. For example, the treatment of cystic fibrosis. So adenoviruses can be genetically engineered. Cystic fibrosis is caused by a single mutation in a single gene. Adenoviruses can be genetically engineered to carry a good copy of the gene into the lungs, which are one of the most commonly infected tissues, and hopefully replace the bad gene with the good, or at least supplement with the good. It may not remove the bad and replace it, but it could integrate somewhere else in the chromosome and replace it. What I want you to think about are situations where you may not want to use a living virus to do gene therapy, or situations where integration of a virus into the host chromosome, even if it's to supplement something like cystic fibrosis, could be a very, very bad thing. Adenoviruses are also being used to make hybrid vaccines for things like HIV and Ebola. When you have a living, right? I'm doing quotes. I know you can't see it, but I'm like air quoting living. When you have an actively replicating virus, even if it's weak, it will stimulate the immune system more than, and I'm doing the air quotes again, a dead virus, right? Than an inactive viral particle. So scientists are working on using attenuated adenoviruses, so ones that are still capable of replication but don't cause severe disease, to deliver antigens like HIV and Ebola antigens, not the actual viruses, in order to teach the immune system in the best way possible what these infections look like. So because adenoviruses will infect so many different types of cells, and because they generally cause a mild infection, they are useful for therapies.